13 seconds. That is how long it took for the tail to come off American Airlines Flight 587 over New York, 2 months and 1 day after 9/11. And that tail was already broken before anyone boarded. 9 of these 10 aircraft were. 1 came apart over Long Island, and more than 200 witnesses reported a streak of light rising toward it. 1 lost 18 feet of its roof at 24,000 feet and landed anyway. The 10th had nothing wrong with it at all, and that is the one that should frighten you. New York, the 12th of November, 2001, 2 months and 1 day after the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 587 was an Airbus A300 bound for Santo Domingo, and it was cleared to line up behind a Japan Airlines 747. At 11:36, the tower cautioned them about wake turbulence. Before they rolled, the first officer asked the captain a question. He asked whether the separation from the 747 ahead looked all right to him. The captain answered. 8 seconds later, the first officer asked again, "So you're happy with it?" Nobody has ever established what he was worried about, but he asked twice. They took off. At 9:15 and 35 seconds, they were climbing through 1,700 feet. 1 second later, the aircraft moved. A 400th of a G forward, 700ths sideways. That was the wake. Almost nothing. The captain said, "Little wake turbulence, huh?" The first officer said, "Yeah." 7 seconds later, they hit it again, and this time the aircraft rolled 25 degrees to the left. What happened next was not the turbulence. Over the next 7 seconds, the first officer moved the rudder pedals from full left to full right and back again, 5 times. You need to understand what that does to an aeroplane. The rudder pushes the tail sideways. Push it one way, and the vertical stabilizer takes the load in one direction. Push it the other way while the aircraft is still swinging from the first input, and the load does not just reverse, it multiplies. And on this particular aircraft, the pedals were extremely sensitive. The A300-600 rudder system reduces pedal travel as speed increases. At 250 knots, moving the rudder from neutral to its full limit takes about an inch of pedal. At 9:15 and 58.4 seconds, the rear right attachment of the vertical stabilizer fractured. Then the other 5 went. The tail came off cleanly and landed in Jamaica Bay. What was left was an aircraft with no directional control at all, at 1,500 feet, over a dense residential neighborhood. It began to rotate. Both engines tore away from the wings before it hit. On the voice recorder, the first officer says, "What are we into? We're stuck in it." The flight data recorder stopped working 13.5 seconds before impact. The aircraft came down on a street in Bell Harbor. 260 people on board, 5 more in the houses, 265 dead. For several hours, New York believed it was happening again. It was not. Here is the part that made this accident an argument instead of a conclusion. The first officer was not improvising. American Airlines had a training course called the Advanced Aircraft Maneuvering Program, and it taught pilots to use the rudder aggressively to recover from an upset. He had been through it. He was doing what he had been taught. So the NTSB had to decide what to call the cause. They settled on the first officer's rudder inputs, with 2 contributing factors: the characteristics of the A300-600 rudder system and American's training program. Then the vice chairman reversed the order of those 2 contributing factors. Whether the aeroplane or the airline got named first. 2 board members voted against the final report because of it. 25 years later, that is still the honest summary of Flight 587. A man did what he was trained to do, on an aircraft that punished it, and the people investigating could not agree which of those 2 sentences goes first. 1 down. 265 people, and The flaw was already in the aircraft when it pushed back from the gate. So was the next one. The 28th of April, 1988. A Boeing 737 hopping between Hawaiian Islands. 24,000 feet. The whole flight is supposed to take 35 minutes. As the passengers walked out to it that afternoon, one of them saw a crack in the aeroplane. Her name was Gail Yamamoto. The crack was on the outside of the fuselage, near the front left door, at about the height of her eyes as she came up the stairs. She looked at it. She got on board. She did not tell anybody, and there is no reason she should have thought it was her job to. It is in the accident report because she told investigators afterwards. 18 feet of the upper fuselage tore away. Not a panel. The roof of the aircraft, from just behind the cockpit back over the first 5 rows. 95 people were on board. 65 were injured. 1 was standing. A flight attendant working the aisle was swept out of the aircraft. Her body was never found. And then the pilots landed it. They got a 737 with no roof down onto a runway on Maui, with 1 engine failing on approach and a cabin full of people holding onto their armrests in a 200-knot wind. Everyone still inside the aeroplane survived. Now, why did the roof come off? That aircraft had flown close to 90,000 pressurization cycles. Almost none of them were long. Island hops, 20 minutes at a time all day for 19 years. Every single one inflated the fuselage slightly and let it deflate again. And it did all of that in salt air. That aeroplane never left the islands. It sat on the ground in humidity and sea spray between flights, year after year, and moisture worked its way into the gaps between the overlapping panels of the skin. Inside those gaps, out of sight, the metal was corroding. The skin of a 737 is made of overlapping panels joined along what is called a lap joint, bonded together and riveted. On the left side of this aircraft, along one of those joints, the bond between the 2 layers had failed. Once the bond goes, the rivets carry everything, and the metal around each rivet hole starts to crack. The cracks were small. They were also in a line, 1 at each hole, pointing at each other. When they met, the joint opened like a zip. The NTSB's probable cause was not written about metal. It was written about people. The cause was the failure of Aloha Airlines maintenance program to detect the disbonding and the fatigue damage. Inspectors had been down that fuselage. The cracks were findable. They were not found. This one accident changed how the industry treats old aircraft. Before Aloha, age was a number in a logbook. After Aloha, there is a formal aging aircraft program, with mandatory structural inspections tied to cycles rather than years. It took an aeroplane landing without a roof, and a woman who was never recovered from the sea to make that happen. 2. A passenger saw the crack with her own eyes as she boarded, and said nothing. Ask yourself what you would have done. The 7th of February, 1980, Kai Tak Airport, Hong Kong. A China Airlines 747 comes in with the nose too high and drags its tail down the runway. Nobody is hurt. It is an expensive, embarrassing, entirely survivable event. The aircraft is taken out of service and repaired. The repair is the whole story. Boeing's structural repair manual is specific about this. Damaged skin has to be cut out. Then a reinforcing plate, a doubler, is fitted over the area, and it has to extend beyond the damage. Neither of those things was done. The damaged skin was left in place, and a doubler was fitted straight over the top of it. From the outside, it looked finished. Underneath it, the cracked metal was still there, still carrying load, and now it was hidden. That aircraft flew for 22 more years. And for most of those years, it was leaving a mark. Until 1995, passengers were allowed to smoke on board. Cigarette smoke went wherever the cabin air went. And on this aircraft, the cabin air was going somewhere it was not supposed to. out through fine cracks in the skin at the repair. Slowly, over years, the smoke deposited a brown nicotine stain on the outside of the fuselage, around the edge of the doubler. That stain was on the exterior of the aeroplane. It was visible. It was photographed. What it meant was that pressurized air had been escaping through fractured metal for a long time. Nobody read it that way. The last detailed inspection of that area was carried out about 4 years before the accident. On the 25th of May, 2002, it left Taipei for Hong Kong with 225 people on board. 20 minutes into the flight, at 35,000 feet, it came apart over the Taiwan Strait, 23 nautical miles northeast of the Penghu Islands. It broke into 4 pieces. There were no survivors. When Taiwan's investigators recovered the wreckage, they found the section where the tail had hit the runway in 1980. They took the doubler off. Underneath, in the skin that should have been removed 22 years earlier, there were fatigue cracks running along the repair. Every flight that aircraft made after 1980 pressurized that hidden metal and let it relax again. Nobody could see it. Not the crews, not the inspectors, because the thing you would need to inspect had a plate bolted over it. A tail strike did not bring down that aeroplane. A tail strike is survivable, and that one was survived by everybody in 1980. What killed 225 people was a repair that was signed off and was not done properly, and then 22 years of nobody having any way to know. 3. That repair sat on the aircraft for 22 years before it finished the job. If crashes like this are new to you, this channel breaks down one every week. Hit subscribe so the next one doesn't slip past you. The 8th of September, 1989. A chartered Convair 580 is carrying 50 Norwegian businessmen from Oslo to Hamburg. It goes into the North Sea, 18 kilometers north of Hirtshals, off the Danish coast. All 50 passengers and all 5 crew are killed. There was no mayday. There was no bad weather. The aircraft simply stopped being an aircraft. When the Norwegian investigators brought the tail up out of the water, they did what you do. They tested the bolts that held the vertical stabilizer onto the fuselage. 3 of them were fake. They had not been heat-treated. Metallurgical testing put them at roughly 60% of the tensile strength of the parts they were supposed to be. They looked right. They had part numbers. They had come through the supply chain with paperwork, and they had been fitted by mechanics who had no way of knowing. There was a second thing wrong, and it is what turned bad bolts into a crash. The auxiliary power unit sits in the tail. The mount holding its front end had already fractured before that flight took off. With the unit running at cruise speed, the entire tail structure was being shaken at a frequency it was never designed to see. Proper bolts would probably have taken it. These ones did not. Partnair 394 is the reason the aviation industry stopped treating counterfeit parts as a rumor. Not a fake engine, not a fake wing. 3 small bolts, bought legitimately, sitting in a store's rack with a certificate attached to them. Getting to that answer took an effort that is easy to skip past. The aircraft was in pieces on the seafloor. The Norwegians recovered it, laid it out, and worked backwards through a structure that had come apart in mid-air over water, with no distress call and no witnesses, to arrive at 3 bolts. After the report came out, investigators around the world started pulling parts out of inventories and testing them. Aviation authorities issued warnings. Manufacturers began stamping and tracing components in ways they had not bothered with before. What none of them could say was how much of this material was already flying. There was no way to know. The whole point of a counterfeit part is that the paperwork is correct. 55 people died off the coast of Denmark because somewhere in a supply chain, somebody made bolts that were cheaper than the real ones, and the paperwork said they were the real ones. 4. Everything that killed them was written down. Signed off, filed, and false. The 17th of July, 1996. TWA Flight 800 lifts off from JFK for Paris with 230 people on board. 12 minutes later, it explodes off Long Island in front of witnesses on the beach. For 4 years, this was the most argued about accident in the world. People saw a streak of light. There were claims of a missile, claims of a bomb, claims of a cover-up. The FBI ran a criminal investigation alongside the NTSB. Here is what the wreckage said. The center wing tank on a 747 sits between the wings, underneath the cabin floor. On that flight, it held almost no fuel. About 50 gallons in a tank that takes thousands. An almost empty fuel tank is not empty. It is full of vapor and air, and that mixture will burn. Underneath that particular tank sit the air conditioning packs, and the aircraft had been on the ground at JFK for hours in July with those packs running. The fuel in the tank was heated to the point where the vapor above it was flammable. All it needed was an ignition source. The NTSB never found it with certainty, and they said so. Their most likely candidate was a short circuit outside the tank that put excessive voltage into the wiring of the fuel quantity indication system. That wiring runs inside the tank because that is where the fuel is that it has to measure. The tank exploded, and the entire forward fuselage, including the cockpit, separated from the aircraft. And then the rest of it kept going up. Without a nose, without a flight deck, with fuel streaming out of the front, the remaining aircraft continued climbing for several thousand feet before it stalled, rolled, and fell into the sea. And that is what the people on the beach saw. Witnesses along the Long Island shore described a streak of light rising into the sky. For years, that description was the strongest argument that a missile had been fired at the aircraft. The NTSB spent a very long time on it because a great deal depended on the answer. Their conclusion was that the witnesses had seen exactly what they said they had seen. They had simply attached it to the wrong object. The burning aeroplane, climbing without its nose, was the light going up. The investigation took 4 years and involved more than 700 people. They pulled the wreckage off the seafloor and rebuilt 90 feet of that aeroplane on a steel frame in a hangar in Calverton. The result is on every airliner flying today. Modern aircraft pump nitrogen into their empty fuel tanks so that there is nothing left in there capable of burning. 5. Halfway. And not one of these has been an accident so far. Every one of them was a decision somebody made. The 26th of May, 1991. Lauda Air Flight 004, a Boeing 767, belonging to the airline Niki Lauda built after he stopped driving racing cars, climbs out of Bangkok for Vienna with 223 people on board. 15 minutes into the climb, a warning appears in the cockpit. It tells the crew that the thrust reverser system on the number 1 engine may have a fault. A thrust reverser is the door that swings into the jet exhaust after landing and throws the thrust forward to slow the aircraft down. On the ground, it is routine. In the air, at altitude, it is a device that turns one of your engines into a brake on one side of the aeroplane. The crew looked it up. The quick reference handbook did not treat that message as an emergency. The captain read it and said it was just an advisory thing. He was not being careless. At that time, the industry genuinely believed that a 767 could survive an in-flight reverser deployment. That belief was in the manuals. It was wrong. Some minutes later, the reverser on the left engine deployed by itself. The aircraft yawed, the airflow over the left wing collapsed, and it stalled. What followed was an uncontrolled descent that the crew had no procedure for, because the procedure had been written on the assumption that this was recoverable. The 767 broke up in the air over Phu Toi in Suphanburi province and came down in the jungle. All 213 passengers and 10 crew were killed. The wiring that would have explained why the reverser deployed was destroyed in the fire, and the specific cause has never been positively identified. But the maintenance record survived. Between the 27th of April and the day of the accident, that aircraft had generated 61 separate thrust reverser fault messages. 61 in 29 days. Every one of them was logged. None of them was treated as a reason to stop flying the aeroplane, because nobody believed the failure they were pointing at could bring an airliner down. The early public suggestion was that the crew had made an error. Niki Lauda refused to accept it and pushed the investigation himself. He went to the manufacturer, sat in a 767 simulator, and had them deploy a thrust reverser in the climb, over and over. The aircraft was unrecoverable within seconds, every time. Nobody in that simulator, knowing exactly what was about to happen and when, could save it. That result is what closed the argument. Boeing changed the design afterwards. On modern aircraft, the thrust reversers are physically locked out unless the main landing gear is on the ground. It is now impossible for the thing that killed those 223 people to happen in flight at all. 6. 5 months of written warnings, ignored. The next crew found their crack. It did not save them. The 19th of December, 2005. A seaplane takes off from Miami Beach for Bimini in the Bahamas. 18 passengers and 2 crew. Chalks had been flying that route since 1917. It was the oldest continuously operating airline in the United States. It took off from the water beside the port of Miami, and for people going to Bimini, it was not an airline so much as a bus that happened to float. The aircraft was a Grumman turbo Mallard, and it was built in 1947. That is not, by itself, a problem. Age is not what kills aeroplanes. Aloha proved that. What kills them is cycles, and what those cycles do to metal that nobody is looking at. 34 seconds after it left the water, the right wing came off. There is film of it. It happened in front of a working harbor, in daylight, close enough to shore that people watched it from the sand. The wings separated at the root. The aircraft rolled inverted and hit the water. Everybody on board was killed. Inside the wing, close to where it joins the fuselage, runs a stringer, a strip of metal that carries load along the length of the structure. That stringer had a crack in it. The crack had started at a slosh hole, one of the openings cut into internal wing structure so that fuel can move through. And this is the part that matters. That crack had been found before. Somebody had seen it, and it had been repaired. The repair did not work. The crack kept growing underneath it, and no subsequent inspection caught that it was still there. The NTSB's probable cause names 2 organizations. The first is Chalks Ocean Airways, for a maintenance program that failed to find and properly repair fatigue cracks in that wing. The second is the Federal Aviation Administration, for failing to detect and correct the deficiencies in that program. That is a regulator being named in its own report as part of the cause. Chalks never really came back. The operation was grounded, restructured, and shut down within a few years, and the seaplane stopped going to Bimini after 88 years. 20 people died a few hundred meters from a beach because a crack was found, patched badly, and then trusted. 7. They found it. They fixed it. It came apart anyway. 3 left. The 10th of January, 1954. A de Havilland comet climbs out of Rome for London. The comet was the first jet airliner in the world. It flew higher than anything else carrying passengers, above the weather, at a speed nothing could match. It was a genuine British triumph, and it was 3 years old. 20 minutes after takeoff, passing 27,000 feet, the radio transmission from the crew stopped in the middle of a sentence. 35 people. The wreckage went into the Mediterranean off Elba. The fleet was grounded, modifications were made, and it went back into service. 3 months later, on the 8th of April, another comet broke up in the air near Naples. 21 more people. At that point, the British authorities did something remarkable. They took a complete comet fuselage, put it inside a tank, filled the tank with water, and then pressurized and depressurized the aircraft over and over again, thousands of times, watching what the structure did. They also went and got the first aircraft back. The Royal Navy spent months working the seafloor off Elba, lifting pieces of a jet airliner out of deep water with the equipment available in 1954. And those pieces were shipped to Farnborough and reassembled on a wooden frame in the shape of an aeroplane. It remains one of the most complete accident investigations ever carried out, and it was done with divers, trawlers, and slide rules. Both investigations arrived at the same place. After just over 3,000 simulated flights, the test fuselage failed, and the failure started at the corner of a cutout in the skin. The Comet's windows were square. A square corner does something specific to stress. Load flowing through a sheet of metal has to go around an opening, and at a sharp corner it concentrates into a point. Every time that aircraft climbed, the cabin inflated and pushed on that point. Every time it descended, it relaxed. Do that a few thousand times and the metal at the corner starts to tear, invisibly from the inside. It is worth being fair to the men who designed it. They had not been careless. In 1949, nobody in the world fully understood what thousands of pressurization cycles do to an aluminum tube. Because until the Comet, no aircraft had ever flown high enough or often enough for it to matter. The Comet found out on behalf of everybody else. Look out of the window on your next flight. It is a rounded rectangle. Every window on every airliner in the world is a rounded rectangle. And it is because of 35 people over Elba and 21 people over Naples. 8. Every one of them carried its own ending on board before it left the gate. The 9th is the exception, the one the investigators could find nothing wrong with. The 5th of March, 1966. A BOAC 707 leaves Tokyo for Hong Kong. Before it did, it had to taxi past something. The previous afternoon, a Canadian Pacific DC-8 had come in short on approach to Haneda, hit the approach lights, and burned on the runway. On the morning of the 5th, the wreckage was still there, and it was still smoking. The BOAC 707 taxied out past it. There is film of it happening. The passengers sitting on the left side of that aeroplane watched the burnt-out remains of another airliner go by their windows, and then they took off. And then they had under an hour to live. That is a coincidence. It is not a cause. But it is why this accident is remembered by people who have never heard of mountain waves. The weather that day was exceptional. Clear, still, the kind of visibility Japan gets a handful of times a winter. The captain requested a visual departure that would take them past Mount Fuji so that the passengers could see it properly. That is not a reckless thing to ask for. Airliners flew sightseeing routes past Fuji regularly. The air over Gotemba tore the aircraft into pieces. There was no cloud. There was no storm. There was no radar return because there was nothing there to return a signal from. When wind crosses a large mountain, it does not simply go over the top and settle down again. It can set up standing waves in the air downwind, like water running over a rock in a river. Those waves are invisible, and when they break, they produce turbulence violent enough to exceed what an airframe is built to survive. The gust load that day was far beyond the design limit of a 707. The vertical fin attachment failed. The fin came away and struck the left horizontal stabilizer, which broke off. Then the rest of the tail went, then the right wing, then the nose. The debris was spread along 10 miles of ground. 113 passengers, 11 crew, 124 people. And now the thing that separates this accident from the other 9. There was no bad repair on that aeroplane, no counterfeit part, no crack that somebody should have found, no training program to argue about, no warning message logged 61 times and ignored. It was a sound aircraft, correctly maintained, flown by an experienced crew on a beautiful day, and the sky broke it anyway. That is the case that has no lesson in it, and it is the reason the other 9 matter so much. The things you cannot control are already out there. The only ones you get to do anything about are the ones inside the aeroplane. 9. Which leaves the one that stayed in the air for 32 minutes after its tail was gone. The 12th of August, 1985. 7 years earlier, on the same aircraft, at Osaka, a landing went wrong and the tail hit the runway. It cracked the rear pressure bulkhead. The rear pressure bulkhead is the wall at the back of the cabin. It holds the pressurized air in. Everything behind it, the tail cone, the fin, the structure that carries the horizontal stabilizer, is outside air. Boeing sent technicians to repair it. The correct repair joins the 2 halves of the bulkhead with a single continuous plate, held by 3 rows of rivets. They used 2 separate plates instead. The join between them meant that one of those 3 rows of rivets was no longer carrying load across the splice. That one detail cut the fatigue life of the joint to a fraction of what it was supposed to be. The paperwork said the aircraft was repaired. It flew for another 7 years and about 12,000 more pressurization cycles on short domestic routes. On the 12th of August, 1985, it left Tokyo for Osaka, full, because it was the Obon holiday and the whole country was traveling to see family. 12 minutes after takeoff, the bulkhead failed. The pressurized air in that cabin went straight out through the back of the aircraft into the tail cone, where there was nowhere for it to go. It blew the vertical stabilizer off the aeroplane. And then it did the thing that made this the worst single aircraft accident in history. A 747 has 4 independent hydraulic systems, so that no single failure can take away control. Independent, but they all have to physically pass through the tail in order to reach the surfaces at the back. All 4 lines ran through the section that had just been destroyed. Within seconds, all 4 were severed and all the fluid was gone. No rudder, no elevators, no ailerons, no spoilers, no flaps. They had 4 engines and nothing else. And they flew it for 32 minutes. The crew worked out that they could turn the aircraft by adding thrust on one side and climb or descend by adding or reducing it on both. With no vertical stabilizer, the aircraft was rolling and pitching in a slow oscillation they could not stop. They fought it across the mountains of Gunma Prefecture, in the dark, using 2 throttle levers. On the cockpit voice recorder, they are working the entire time. There is no panic on that tape. In the cabin, some of the passengers wrote notes to their families. 520 of the 524 people on board were killed when the aircraft came down on the ridge of Mount Osutaka. 4 people survived. All 4 were sitting in the same part of the aircraft, the left side, towards the back, in the last few rows. One of them was an off-duty flight attendant traveling as a passenger. She gave investigators an account of the night that changed how the accident is understood. She described hearing other people in the wreckage after the impact. Voices, a boy calling out, movement, and then, gradually, over the hours, fewer of them. Rescue teams did not reach the site until the following morning. The tail strike at Osaka in 1978 injured nobody at all. 9 of these 10 aircraft carried their own failure into the air with them. Some of them for a few weeks, some for 22 years. In almost every case, somebody had already found the evidence and written it down. A fault message, an inspection, a repair signed off. The 10th was perfect, and it made no difference at all. We have made a full documentary on Japan Airlines 123, the whole 32 minutes, minute by minute. It is on screen now. If you got this far, this channel is built for you. One aviation investigation every week, from the official reports and nothing else. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.